One of the most common questions I hear is, if there is a God and he is good and he is loving, how come there is evil and suffering in the world? Well, the interesting thing to that question is there are actually two levels to the question of suffering. There's the kind of philosophical level to the question. How do we reconcile the existence of a God who is good and powerful with evil and suffering in the world? But there's also the emotional level to the question. Because most people, when they experience evil and suffering, it's not the philosophical question that bothers them so much as the way that the problem of suffering hits us here at the level of the heart and the emotions. And I think the reason that the question is so common and so tricky in some ways to answer is because it's operating at those two levels. So as Christians engaging with people wrestling with it, make sure that we answer the question of the head and of the heart at the same time. That said, what can we say about the problem of evil in a few short minutes? Well, a few thoughts I'd like to place in front of you. Here's the first one. You can't argue from the existence of evil to the non-existence of God. A few atheists have tried it, but it's not actually possible to make that step. Let me tell you why. A few decades ago, there was a very famous debate took place between the then leading atheist in the world. His name was Bertrand Russell, and one of the sharpest Christian minds on the planet. He was a Jesuit priest called Father Frederick Copleston, and they clashed in a very high-profile debate. Well, during that debate, Copleston looks across the stage at Bertrand Russell and says, "Dr. Russell, could you tell me how, as an atheist, you define good and evil?" Russell thought about it for a moment and he said, well, I guess I tell the difference between good and evil in the same way that I tell the difference between blue and yellow. But, said Copleston, you tell the difference between blue and yellow, don't you, by seeing. How do you tell the difference between good and evil? Russell scratched his head and he said, well, I guess I tell the difference between good and evil on the basis of feeling. Well, Copleston was too much of a gentleman because, as one of my colleagues points out, what he should have done at that point is looked at Dr. Russell and said, Bertrand Russell, you know, in some countries, they love their neighbour. In other countries, they eat their neighbour, all on the basis of feeling. What is your personal preference? And lying behind that clash was the idea that if you remove God, if you throw God out, with God goes any basis for a standard of what good and evil mean in the first place. Good and evil become just personal preference, and then we really are in trouble. So if there is no God behind the universe, then talk of good and evil disappears anyway. You see, the moment that you talk about evil and suffering, you are implying that there is a way the world ought to be. If I name something evil, if I say something is suffering, I'm saying the world ought not to be this way. But if all we have is matter and molecules, if we live in a godless universe, what gives me the right to say the world ought to be any particular way? It shouldn't. It's just molecules in motion. Here's the interesting thing though. Because we live in a world in which there is evil and suffering and pain, all of us are forced to answer the question, whether we are Christians, whether we are Muslims, whether we are Buddhists, or whether we are atheists. The atheist answer to the problem of evil and suffering is really to say, that's just the way of the world. We've got here by time plus chance plus natural selection. And when evolution operates, well, some people are going to get hurt. The weak will get hurt, the strong will survive. Buddhism says, why is there evil and suffering? Well, it's karma. The reason that your child was raped and murdered in this life is perhaps because in a previous life, you too were a rapist and a murderer, and the universe is paying you back. Those are not really answers. I don't see answers to the problem of evil and suffering lying in those other worldviews. But what of Christianity? What does Christianity say? Well, it's interesting. When most of us are faced with evil and suffering, I think what we want is not something said about evil, but we want something done about evil. And at the heart of the claim of who God is in the biblical understanding is that God is a God who is compassionate. Think about the word compassion for a moment. What does compassion mean? The word compassion comes from two Latin words, com and passion. Com with, passion, suffering. For someone to show compassion means they don't merely have to look at something and say that it's wrong, they have to step into the situation and do something about it. That's what the word compassion means. Only in Christianity will you find the claim that there is not merely a God who set the world up, but a God who, when it comes to evil and suffering, has, in the person of Jesus Christ and his cross, stepped into the world and done something about evil and suffering.